The senators arrived early. They took their seats in silence. No one spoke to his neighbor. No one met another man's eyes. They sat in the chamber that had once been the heart of the world's greatest republic. And they waited. They were waiting for a name to be erased, a vote to be cast. And when the vote was finished, when the chisels began their work across the city, when the statues came down and the inscriptions were scraped clean, the men in that chamber did not cheer. They simply exhaled. For the first time in 15 years, they exhaled. The man they feared was dead. His name was Domitian, and for a decade and a half he had ruled the greatest empire on earth in a silence so complete that men had learned to control their faces, to manage their expressions at dinner, to write letters knowing every word might be read by someone else first, to live inside an empire that had once been the most confident civilization in the world and had become, under this one man, a place where even the most powerful people alive were afraid to speak. Tonight we follow the emperor who made Rome quiet, who built the most magnificent palace the ancient world had ever seen, and sat at its center in a solitude so absolute that a courtier once joked, when asked whether anyone was with the emperor, that not even a fly was in the room. Who governed a world of 60 million people and could not trust a single one of them? Who was feared by everyone around him precisely because he was afraid? Settle in, let the world go still, and we will take our time with this story, because it deserves to be told slowly, the way the Romans themselves built everything they built, one stone pressed against another, until something vast and permanent rose out of the plain. To understand Domitian, you first have to understand the family he came from, because the Flavians were not like the dynasties that preceded them. They were not descended from Julius Caesar. They carried none of the mythological weight of the Julio-Claudian line. They came from Rete, a small town in the Sabine Hills northeast of Rome, a place of farmers and local merchants and respectable provincial magistrates, a place that the old senatorial families in their ancient houses on the Palatine would have acknowledged with a certain careful courtesy that was not quite warmth. Vespasian, Domitian's father, had built his career the hard way, through military command, through competent administration, through the management of influence across a lifetime. He had served in Britain under Claudius's invasion in 43 AD and had distinguished himself commanding the Second Legion Augusta through a campaign that the Romans still talked about. He had served in Africa. He had been sent east to suppress the great Jewish revolt that was consuming Palestine. He was there in Judea with his legions when the world cracked open, because in 68 AD Nero killed himself and the secret of empire, as Tacitus would later write, was disclosed. The secret being that an emperor did not have to come from Rome, that the legions of the provinces could make a man emperor as surely as the Praetorian Guard in the capital. And in the chaos of the following year, the year of 4 emperors, 3 men rose to the purple and died, and Vespasian, with the most experienced and loyal armies in the east at his back, was the last man standing. He entered Rome in 70 AD as emperor, and he spent the next decade doing what practical men do after catastrophic civil wars. He stabilized things. He reformed the finances. He rebuilt the government with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had spent his career in administration and understood exactly what an administration required. He had a dry humor and a farmer's directness and no patience for ceremony. And these qualities made him effective in the specific way that people who do not confuse dignity with usefulness tend to be effective. Titus, his elder son, had everything a Roman could want in an heir. Handsome and charming and militarily successful, he had completed the siege of Jerusalem while his father was consolidating power in Rome. And the triumph they celebrated together was one of the great public spectacles of the age. You can still see the carved relief on the Arch of Titus at the edge of the Roman Forum. The captured menorah from the temple carried through the streets of the city in procession. The crowd cheering on both sides, the emperor and his heir riding together into their glory. Titus became emperor in 79 AD, when Vespasian died, and he ruled for only 2 years. But those 2 years were marked by catastrophes so overwhelming that later generations would struggle to believe so much disaster could compress into so short a reign. Vesuvius erupted in the summer of 79 AD and buried Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash and pumice and darkness. A great fire burned through Rome in 80 AD. Plague struck the city in the same year, and Titus responded to each disaster with the generosity and the personal engagement of a man who seemed to understand that being present in the suffering of your people was the most important thing a ruler could offer. He was mourned when he died as one of the best emperors Rome had known, and Domitian was watching all of it from the edge of the room. He had been born in Rome in 51 AD, the third child of Vespasian, the second son, and his earliest years were spent in a household that was not yet great. His mother, Flavia Domitilla, died when he was young. The family's finances were unimpressive enough that later writers felt comfortable describing his childhood in terms that emphasized its modesty. The future emperor of Rome had grown up without the luxury he would later inhabit, and the distance between those two conditions seems never to have entirely left him. The years of civil war in 68 and 69 AD were the years that formed him, and they formed him in fear. He was 17 or 18 when Nero died, and Rome dissolved into the violence of competing claims. His father was in the east. His brother was with the armies, and Domitian was in Rome. A young man without power or protection in a city where the wrong association could get you killed, where the faction that was powerful in the morning might be arrested by evening. When Vitellius's forces occupied Rome and his father's cause was not yet secure, Domitian sheltered with relatives or went into hiding. The sources are not entirely clear on the precise sequence, but what they agree on is the vulnerability. A young man alone in a city at war with itself, learning for the first time and in the most visceral possible way what it felt like to have everything depend on the next hour's news. To know that your survival was not in your hands, that you were subject to forces you could not control or predict or escape. He was eventually brought before Vitellius and released. The reasons are unclear, and when the Flavian forces finally took the city, when his father's general Antonius Primus rode in and the war was effectively over, Domitian emerged as the nominal representative of the victorious family. He began making appointments and issuing proclamations with the authority of the Flavian name. He took the moment seriously, and then the senior commanders pulled back. They limited what he could do. They managed him carefully. They waited for Vespasian himself to arrive and take real control, and Domitian stood in the space between the moment of power and its withdrawal, tasting something and then having it removed. And this seems to have lodged in him permanently. The brief experience of authority, followed by the careful management of his distance from it. The sense that the thing he was supposed to inherit was being held from him by the very people who claimed to serve his family for the next decade, through his father's reign and then through his brother's. Domitian was present but marginal, honored publicly, and trusted with nothing that mattered. He held consulships and led a campaign against the Germanic Chatti in 70 AD that the sources treat with varying degrees of seriousness, some crediting him with genuine military work and others suggesting it was more ceremonial than real. He was given the offices that the system required the emperor's son to have, and was kept from the power that those offices were supposed to represent. The relationship between Domitian and Titus was complicated in ways that the surviving evidence only partially illuminates. They were brothers, and they grew up together, but they were very different in temperament. The charming eldest son who seemed to make every room brighter and the quieter. More solitary younger son who was watching, who was always watching. The dynamic between them is one that families across all cultures and eras know, and the sources hint at a genuine distance between the two, even a hostility. Suetonius reports suspicions that Domitian had plotted against Titus during the reign, which may reflect real tension or may reflect the court gossip that accumulates around any spare heir in a monarchical system. What is clear is that when Titus died of fever in September of 81 AD and Domitian became emperor at the age of 30, he was a man who had spent his adult life waiting for a power he could see but not touch, who had learned vulnerability in a burning city during civil war, who had watched his father and his brother hold what was theoretically his future for over a decade, and who had developed in that long corridor of waiting a set of habits and responses that would shape the most feared reign in the first century of the Roman Principate. He was also, and this is the thing that gets lost in the story of what came later, genuinely capable. The first years of his reign were not the terror. They were the reign of a man who wanted to show that he could govern seriously in the traditional Roman modes. He reformed the currency, stabilizing the silver content of the denarius to a standard his father had maintained and his brother had allowed to slip, a reform that the merchants and the soldiers and the tax collectors would have felt immediately and materially. He enforced the laws against corruption in the provinces with a rigor that the ordinary population found genuinely welcome, even as the senatorial class experienced it as a threat. He sat personally in the courts rather than delegating entirely. He paid attention to the administrative detail of the empire in a way that the hostile literary sources would later find it convenient to ignore. And he built the building program that Domitian pursued throughout his reign, transformed the physical face of Rome in ways that every subsequent Roman emperor would live inside. The great palace complex on the Palatine Hill that he raised with his architect Rabirius was the largest and most elaborate structure any Roman emperor had yet attempted. It covered most of the hill and was organized around a series of great rooms. The audience chamber, where petitioners came before the emperor. The dining room, so enormous that the poet Statius wrote an entire poem about the experience of eating in it and still could not quite capture the scale. The sunken garden at the center, with its miniature hippodrome, where Domitian walked in the late afternoons. The audience chamber was designed with a specific psychological intention. The raised throne at one end, the vast marble floor stretching out before it, the ceiling at a height that made the petitioner feel small and the emperor seem enormous. The whole space calibrated to produce the feeling that you were standing before something that was not entirely human, that you had come into the presence of a power so far above ordinary life that the correct response was to become very small and very still. Because this is what Domitian believed, that the emperor was not the first citizen among citizens in the old Augustan fiction, but the Lord and God, Dominus et Deus, the titles the sources say he demanded informal address, a claim that the senatorial class found genuinely offensive and that became one of the central items in the prosecutorial case that history assembled against him. The Palatine Palace was visible from half of Rome. It dominated the skyline, the way that power was supposed to dominate everything else. And in its rooms, Domitian governed the world, dispatching governors and generals and administrators to provinces he had mostly never visited, receiving embassies from Parthia and Britain and Numidia, making decisions whose effects would ripple outward to the edges of the empire and back again in reports. He would read alone in the evenings in his private apartments. Alone is the important word. The sources describe him walking the colonnades of his palace in the late afternoon, catching flies on a stylus, impaling them one by one, which is the most famous detail in Suetonius's account of his character, and which has served ever since as a kind of emblem of the anxious mind finding, in very small controllable things, a relief from the enormous uncontrollable pressures of the position. It is disturbing, and it is unexpectedly human, and it is the image that has lasted because it contains something true about what that kind of absolute, solitary power does to a person. He had mirrors installed along the corridors of the palace, polished stone that reflected the space behind anyone walking through them. And this has been interpreted ever since as a security measure, a way of seeing who was behind him as he walked. Whether this is literally accurate or apocryphal, it captures something essential about the experience of his reign. The Emperor of Rome watching his own back in the corridors of his own palace. The Germans were his proudest military achievement. The campaign against the Chatti in 82 to 83 AD, the Germanic tribe occupying territory east of the Rhine in what is now central Germany, was a real military operation that resulted in a real triumph celebrated in Rome. And whatever the hostile literary tradition later said about its substance, the subsequent reorganization of the German frontier, the construction of the limes, the complex system of roads and forts and watchtowers that defined the boundary between Roman territory and the lands beyond, was a serious strategic achievement that modern military historians have credited appropriately. The limes that Domitian built would define Rome's northern boundary in the region for more than a century. The Dacian wars that followed from 85 to 89 AD were harder. The Dacians, under their king Decebalus, crossed the Danube in 85 AD and defeated and killed the Roman governor of Mysia, one of the most serious military reverses of the Flavian period. Domitian responded with sustained and costly campaigns that eventually produced a peace settlement controversial enough that the literary sources treated it as humiliation. It required Rome to pay Decebalus an annual subsidy in exchange for cooperation on the frontier. And the Senate and the historians who wrote for the Senate described this as tribute paid to a barbarian. But Decebalus was genuinely formidable. The same Decebalus who forced this settlement from Domitian required to massive campaigns from Trajan to finally defeat. Trajan spent his entire reign fighting him and still needed 2 full wars, which suggests that the settlement Domitian reached was not as dishonorable as the literary tradition suggests. It was the assessment of a pragmatic man who understood what the military situation actually was, who was buying stability at a cost that was probably cheaper than the alternative. The Sarmatian crisis of 92 AD was another genuine frontier emergency. A combined Sarmatian and Suabi force crossed the Danube and destroyed the Legio 21 Rapax, an entire Roman legion, one of the most serious military disasters of the reign. Domitian personally led forces to restore the frontier, and the boundary was eventually stabilized, but not before the casualties and the expense had added another layer to the pressures accumulating around the throne. He was managing a world empire with real external threats, real administrative complexity, real financial demands, and at the same time he was managing a domestic political situation that was deteriorating in ways that would eventually become the defining story of the reign. The senatorial class that produced the literary tradition experienced Domitian as terror, not as an abstraction, not as a historical category, but as the specific lived experience of not knowing whether your dinner conversation was being reported, whether the friend across the table was someone who might repeat what he heard in exchange for imperial favor, whether the letter you were writing to your brother in Gaul would be read by someone else first, the experience of being a powerful person in a system that suddenly decided that powerful people were the most dangerous category and needed to be watched most closely. The delatores, the informers, who had been a feature of Roman political life since the late Republic, became under Domitian a dominant and terrifying institution. Men who brought accusations against prominent people with the expectation of financial reward from the proceeds of confiscation, who turned the normal social fabric of Roman life into a network of potential surveillance, who made it dangerous to have opinions and more dangerous to express them, because expressed opinions could be reported. Reported opinions could become charges, and charges could become trials, and trials could become death, and the death of a senator meant the confiscation of his estate, which funded the informer who had brought the charge, Pliny the Younger, who survived the reign and who wrote about it afterward with the urgency of a man who needed to say what he had been unable to say for 15 years. Describes the atmosphere of those years with a specificity that has shaped all subsequent understanding. The careful management of what you said and to whom you said it. The awareness that the wrong comment to the wrong person at the wrong moment could begin a sequence of events you could not stop. The terrible social paralysis of a class that had historically exercised real public power and that now found itself unable to speak freely in its own dining rooms. Pliny was not fabricating, he was describing a real experience, but he was also a man who had survived and who had reasons both personal and political to emphasize the terror, to explain his own caution during those years, and to honor the contrast with the Trigenic reign under which he was finally writing freely. His account is evidence, and it is advocacy simultaneously. As most surviving accounts of this period are, the Stoic philosophers occupied an unusual position in the drama of Domitian's court. They had a long tradition in Rome of providing an intellectual framework for resistance to tyranny. The Stoic conviction that virtue was the only true good and that political liberty was essential to the virtuous life had given a series of philosophers over the preceding century the theoretical grounding to refuse compliance with imperial demands they found unjust, sometimes at the cost of their lives, and this tradition of principled resistance was genuinely threatening to an emperor who was demanding not just compliance but enthusiasm. Domitian expelled philosophers from Rome twice, in 89 AD and again in 95 AD. And these expulsions were not random gestures of hostility toward learning. They were political acts aimed at a group that was embedded in aristocratic households, that influenced the thinking of the men Domitian was most suspicious of, and that was providing a theoretical vocabulary for resistance that made resistance feel like virtue rather than disloyalty. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, who had been a slave and who was present in Rome during part of Domitian's reign before the expulsion, preserved in his teachings some of the texture of the period from a vantage point that none of the senatorial sources could provide. He was watching the same Rome but from below rather than above, and his meditations on the relationship between external power and inner freedom, on the difference between the things within our control and the things outside it, reflect a man who was thinking through the philosophical implications of living inside a system that could destroy anyone at any moment, regardless of their virtue or their innocence. The specific executions that the literary sources enumerate are worth examining individually because they are not random. They follow a political logic. They cluster around people who had reason to be seen as potential threats. Men with too much popularity, or too much military prestige, or too much connection to the old senatorial traditions that valued collective deliberation over individual autocratic will. And men who were too close to the Flavian family by blood, because Domitian was as suspicious of his relatives as he was of his political opponents. Flavius Clemens, his own cousin, was executed late in the reign on a charge the sources associate with Judaism or Christianity, or some form of philosophical non-compliance. The precise charge is unclear, but the fact that Domitian killed a member of his own family tells you something about the state of mind that the revolt of Saturninus had produced. The revolt of Lucius Antonius Saturninus in January of 89 AD was the crisis point that defined the second half of his reign. Saturninus was the governor of Upper Germany who declared himself emperor, who had the legions of the Rhine behind him, who was everything that Domitian's nightmares had been constructing for years. A trusted senior commander with a loyal army who had decided that the throne was available. The revolt lasted perhaps 3 months. It was suppressed when the Rhine did not freeze, and the Germanic allies who had been expected to support Saturninus could not cross. When the governor of Lower Germany remained loyal and caught the rebellion between two forces, but its effect on Domitian was permanent, not because he had been close to losing, but because he now knew with absolute certainty what he had feared for years, that it was possible that one of his own commanders could decide to make this move, that the loyalty he had assumed could be withdrawn, that the system of surveillance and control he had been building was not enough because Saturninus had gotten far enough to declare himself before being caught. The hardening that followed the suppression of the revolt is documented in the sources with a consistency that suggests it was visible and felt immediately by those in the court. The trials became more frequent, the informers more active, the charges less specific, the atmosphere in the Senate House more suffocating. Men who had been managing the Domitianic court by being careful now found that careful was not sufficient, that even the appearance of having once said something that could be construed as critical could be enough. The Senate itself was made the instrument of the terror. Senators were required to sit in judgment on their colleagues, to vote on condemnations brought before them by the emperor's agents, to participate in the system as both its audience and its tool, and the corruption that this produced. The experience of men who knew that the trial before them was unjust and who voted for condemnation anyway because the alternative was to be next, was something that Pliny and Tacitus returned to repeatedly in their writings after the reign ended. The self-accusation of men who had survived by complying with a system they recognized as unjust. Tacitus, who would become the greatest historian Rome produced, and who was building his career in the Senate during these years, survived the Domitianic period with a care that he later described in the Agricola with the precision of a man who had been paying very close attention. He had held office under Domitian, had advanced his career within the system he later condemned, and the moral complexity of this position, of having cooperated with what you knew to be wrong because resistance meant death, became one of the central concerns of his historical writing. The Agricola, written just after Domitian's death, is the first and in some ways most powerful document of this complexity. It is a biography of Tacitus's father-in-law, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, who had governed Britain as Rome's most successful general there, who had pushed the frontier further north than any Roman commander before him, who had survived the Domitianic period through a combination of genuine service and careful political withdrawal. And embedded in this biography of a good man trying to serve well under a bad emperor is a meditation on what it costs to try to be honest inside a system that punishes honesty. Agricola's British campaigns from 77 to 84 AD were among the most militarily successful operations of the reign. He drove the Roman frontier into what is now Scotland. He won the Battle of Mons Graupius, somewhere in the Highland North, against a confederation of British tribes. And this success seems to have been exactly what made his position dangerous, because an extremely successful general in Britain was also an extremely popular general with his troops. And popularity with troops was precisely the thing that Domitian was most afraid of in the wake of Saturninus's revolt. Tacitus says Domitian recalled Agricola from Britain because he could not tolerate the comparison between Agricola's military success and his own more complicated frontier management. And Agricola, after his recall, lived quietly in Rome, accepting the diminishment, not making himself visible, dying in 93 AD of illness and allowing Tacitus to wonder forever afterward whether the illness had been natural or assisted. The poets and writers of the reign occupy a position in this story that is both revealing and uncomfortable for what it reveals. Martial and Statius both wrote under Domitian, and both praised him in terms that the later tradition found embarrassing. Martial's epigrams are dense with complimentary references to the emperor. Statius's Sylvae include poems celebrating his building program and his person, with what reads in some passages as genuine rather than merely obligatory admiration. Martial is the more interesting case because he was in every other context one of the most honest writers Rome produced. His wit and his clarity about the realities of human behavior are not the characteristics of a man who could easily maintain a false position. And his praise of Domitian was shaped by the most ordinary of motivations. He needed the emperor's favor. He needed the patronage network that access to the court made possible. And this practical necessity was enough to produce a body of laudatory verse that the subsequent tradition found damning. The poets who praised him were not fools or cowards. They were people navigating the specific constraints of their world in the NW8 that most people in most worlds navigate the specific constraints of theirs. Quintilian, whose great work on rhetoric and education, the Institutio Oratoria, was published during the reign, found a way to produce something genuinely useful and lasting within the Domitianic cultural context. The Institutio is not flattery. It is a serious and sustained account of how to educate an orator that remains valuable 2,000 years later. It reflects a man who found in the work itself a space insulated from the political pressures of the moment, who built something that could outlast the court that surrounded him. The Jewish and Christian populations of the empire were affected by Domitian's reign in ways that the literary sources written by and for the senatorial class do not fully capture. The fiscus iud, the tax that had been imposed on Jews after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and that redirected the temple tax to Rome, was collected under Domitian with an aggressiveness that extended beyond the Jewish community to anyone accused of practicing Jewish customs without formally identifying as Jewish. Suetonius records witnessing personally one of the examinations conducted to determine whether a man was subject to the tax, a humiliating physical inspection that gives some sense of the brutality with which the fiscal machinery of the late Domitianic period operated. The Book of Revelation, the great visionary text that concludes the New Testament, was almost certainly written in this period or immediately after it. Its imagery of Rome as Babylon, the great whore drunk with the blood of martyrs, its numerical games encoding the name of the emperor, its vision of a cosmic judgment that would overturn the apparently invincible power of the imperial system, reads most coherently as a response to the experience of communities in the eastern provinces under pressure to participate in the civic, religious life centered on imperial cult worship, to offer the pinch of incense before the emperor's image that civic membership required, which was for Christians and for many Jews a line they would not cross, and whose crossing could have serious practical consequences for their relationships with their neighbors and their ability to participate in the economic life of their cities. the 7 letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, with which Revelation begins, address communities navigating exactly this pressure. The letter to Smyrna acknowledges poverty and tribulation. The letter to Pergamon acknowledges living where Satan's throne is, meaning living in a city with a major imperial cult center. These are not abstractions. They are descriptions of a specific political and social situation in which religious conviction was in tension with the demands of the civic system, a tension that Domitian's enforcement of imperial cult participation made more acute than it had been under his predecessors. The physical world of Rome, in which all of this political drama played out, was a city of extraordinary complexity and density. 1 million people compressed into the valleys between the 7 hills, in apartment buildings of 4 and 5 and 6 stories that lined narrow streets never intended for the population they served, in workshops and markets and bath complexes and temples and the massive entertainment structures that the Flavian dynasty had built as part of its claim on Roman public life. The Flavian amphitheater, what we call the Colosseum, had been begun by Vespasian and completed by Titus, but Domitian added to it and to the city around it with the systematic thoroughness that characterized his approach to building. The 4th tier, the wooden upper level, the storerooms, and the network of corridors beneath the arena floor, all of these were Domitianic contributions. The complex that tourists walk through today was in its essential form his creation. The new stadium in the Campus Martis, whose shape survives perfectly in the outline of the modern Piazza Navona, was built on a scale that could accommodate 30,000 spectators for the Greek-style athletic competitions that Domitian introduced to Rome as part of the Capitoline Games he established in 86 AD. Competitions in music and poetry and athletics and horse racing that were modeled on the great Greek festivals and that continued after his death, which tells you something about their genuine popularity, regardless of what the literary tradition says about the emperor who created them. The forum that bears the name of Nerva, but that was substantially Domitian's project. A long, narrow space forced into an unusual shape by the surrounding buildings was given an interior colonnade of such inventiveness that it became one of the most admired public spaces in Rome. And at the end of it, he placed a temple of Minerva, his patron goddess, the goddess of wisdom and craft and war, whose cult he maintained with a devotion the sources describe as something more than conventional piety. He dreamed of her, consulted her, kept her image throughout his palace. The night spectacles in the Colosseum, the gladiatorial combats and animal hunts conducted by torchlight that extended the games into the hours of darkness, were described by contemporaries with a mixture of fascination and unease that suggests they were unlike anything Rome had seen before. Tens of thousands of people in the enormous space of the amphitheater lit by fire, watching violence in the dancing shadows. The scale and the strangeness of it, a kind of distillation of what the Domitianic reign felt like at its most extreme, magnificent and disturbing at once. The villa at Albanum in the Alban Hills, southeast of Rome, was where Domitian went when the city became too much. And he went there often enough in the later years of the reign that the pattern itself became a political statement, a withdrawal from the Senate and from the senatorial class that had earned his contempt, and whose company he had ceased to be able to manage. The court followed him to Albanum, and governance continued there. But the distance from the city allowed both the emperor and the senatorial class a form of relief that each found necessary, even if neither would have described it that way. It was also at Albanum that he hunted, one of the few activities the sources agree he genuinely enjoyed. The physical activity of the chase in open country, the focus and the skill required, the clean simplicity of a pursuit with a clear objective and a clear outcome, something that the management of an empire never offered. The astrologers who had told him he would die in the 5th hour of a specific day were believed seriously enough to affect his behavior in the final period of his life. The accounts of his last weeks describe an emperor who was watching the hours pass with an attention to the time that approached obsession, who was in a state of heightened anxiety about the people around him, who understood that his death had been predicted, but not by whom it would be administered. He had reasons for this anxiety that were not merely irrational. The conspiracy that would kill him was already forming in the household closest to him. Parthenius, his chamberlain, was at its center, the man who managed all access to the emperor, who knew his schedule and his habits and the precise geography of his private life, was meeting with others in the palace and planning the act that would end the reign. And Domitian's anxiety, whatever its specific focus, was an accurate perception of genuine danger. The paranoia was not a delusion, it was correct. On September 18th of 96 AD, a man named Stephanus came to the emperor with a document he said contained evidence of a conspiracy. He had been wearing bandages on his arm for days, telling people he had an injury he was nursing. The dagger was hidden under the bandages. As Domitian was reading the document, Stephanus drove the dagger into his groin. What followed was not the dignified death of imperial tradition. It was a struggle. Domitian wounded Stephanus with a stylus and tried to reach for a dagger he kept under his pillow and found it missing. Someone had already removed it. He grappled with Stephanus with his bare hands. He called for a servant boy to bring him a weapon. The boy had been kept out of the room as part of the plan. He was stabbed repeatedly and finally died. 54 years old, emperor for 15 years. The boys who had been his personal attendants and who were in or near the room described afterward what they had witnessed, a death that was neither quick nor dignified, which is the most honest account available of what violent death looks like when the literary conventions that smooth its edges are removed. The body was taken by his wet nurse, a woman named Phyllis who had known him since infancy and who mixed his ashes with those of his niece, Julia, who had been dear to him, and buried them together in the temple of the Flavian family on the Quirinal. This small act of loyalty from the woman who had nursed him is one of those details that resists interpretation and simply sits in the historical record as a human fact inside a story that has otherwise become almost entirely about political abstractions. The Senate that same day voted the damnatio, the condemnation of memory, the most complete legal erasure available to them. His statues were pulled from their pedestals across Rome and across the empire. His name was chiseled from inscriptions. The palace he had built was rededicated to his successor. The coins bearing his image were melted. The official record of his reign was systematically revised to reduce his presence in it, and the men who voted for this condemnation did so with a thoroughness that told you something about how completely he had dominated the years preceding it, because the effort required to remove a person from history is proportional to how present that person was. And the scale of the damnatio voted against Domitian tells you that he had inscribed and built and commemorated his reign with an intensity that required equally intensive demolition. The scars left by the chisels are still visible today on stone across the former empire. The blank spaces where his name was scraped out speak more clearly than the text they replaced because they marked the shape of a specific kind of hatred, the hatred of people who had been genuinely afraid and were now able to act on 15 years of accumulated anger. Nerva was brought in immediately, an elderly senator of old family and no dangerous ambitions, a man in his mid-60s who everyone understood was a transition rather than a destination. Who could hold the Principate steady while the question of what came next was settled? He lasted less than 2 years before dying of natural causes, and before dying he adopted Trajan, the successful governor of Upper Germany, as his son and successor. And with that adoption, the principate passed to the man who would become the standard of comparison for every subsequent emperor, the measure against which all others were judged. Trajan's success in the Dacian Wars, the 2 great campaigns against Decebalus that finally conquered the kingdom Domitian had been forced to settle with, was built on the frontier infrastructure that Domitian had constructed and the strategic understanding of the Danubian region that 15 years of Flavian frontier management had produced. The roads and the fortifications and the supply systems that Trajan's legions used were in significant part the legacy of the man whose name had been removed from the stones they were built from. The administrative machinery that made the Trigenic and then the Antonine period function so smoothly was in substantial measure the machinery that Domitian had built and refined. The professionalized imperial bureaucracy with its specialized secretariats, the expanded equestrian administration, the legal innovations, the financial systems, all of this continued and was built upon rather than replaced, and the building it continued was labeled with successors' names, while the builder's name was chiseled away. The literary tradition that shaped all subsequent understanding of Domitian was produced by men who had lived through his reign in exactly the position most likely to produce the portrait of a tyrant: senators and their clients, members of the class that had experienced his refusal to maintain the republican fictions as a personal assault, who had sat in the Senate and voted for condemnations they knew were unjust, who had watched colleagues and friends tried and executed and exiled, who had managed the 15 years of his reign by being very careful, and who were now, finally, able to say what they thought. Tacitus is the supreme figure in this tradition, the greatest historian Rome produced, whose compressed and bitter prose style reflects in its very structure the experience of 15 years in which saying too much in the wrong place had been dangerous, whose sentences work the way they do because a man who has learned that words cost lives develops a different relationship with them than a man who has always been free. The greatness of Tacitian prose is genuinely inseparable from the Domitianic experience. The style is the product of the period as much as of individual genius, but Tacitus is also making an argument, and the argument is shaped by what he needs the argument to accomplish. He is building a case for the importance of political liberty and against autocracy, using Domitian as his primary exhibit, and the case he builds is coherent and powerful and not false, but it is selective. The selection of the evidence that builds the portrait of a tyrant, rather than the selection of the evidence that would build a more complicated portrait. Modern historians reading these sources against the grain, supplementing the literary tradition with the administrative record and the conscriptions and the coins and the archaeological evidence of the building program, find a more complicated figure, a man of genuine administrative competence, who was also genuinely frightened, who did many things well, and in doing them built the foundations that his successors' reputations would rest on, and who simultaneously created the conditions that made his own murder inevitable. The specific tragedy of his reign, if it is useful to think of it that way, is that he was not wrong about the threat. The conspiracy that killed him was real. The people closest to him were involved in it. The paranoia was an accurate perception of genuine danger, and his response to the danger. Every senator he prosecuted, every philosopher expelled, every dinner conversation reported, made the danger worse, created more people with reasons for additional hatred, tightened the spiral that ended in his bedroom on a September afternoon. The Rome he ruled was a city in the full expression of its imperial power. 1 million people in 7 hills, fed by grain ships from Egypt and North Africa. supplied with marble from every province of the empire, organized around the entertainment and the administration and the commerce of a world capital, and from the palace on the Palatine that he had built to express his absolute authority over all of this. You could look down on the whole of it, the forums and the temples and the crowded neighborhoods, the Tiber curving through it toward the sea. He stood at those windows and looked down at a city of 1 million people and trusted no one in it. The philosophers he expelled had argued that inner freedom was independent of external circumstances, that a man could be free in chains if his mind was free, and Domitian's life was in some ways the perfect demonstration of the argument's mirror image, that a man could be enslaved in the exercise of absolute power, that the most powerful person in the world could be the most comprehensively caught inside a set of fears that his power created rather than resolved, unable to speak honestly to anyone around him, unable to form relationships that were not distorted by the asymmetry of what he was. The corridors of the palace with their polished mirrors, the captured flies on the stylus, the daily question of what time it was in the final weeks, what hour of the predicted day he was in. All of these images from the ancient sources are images of a man who was not free, who was imprisoned not by chains, but by the combination of his position and his fears, and the habits of mind that 15 years of managing both had produced. The night is settling over the Palatine now. The ruins are dark and still, and the scale of what was there is still legible in the spread of the broken stone. The outline of the rooms, the dimensions of the spaces where people moved and spoke and were afraid. The place where the most feared man in the 1st century of the Roman Empire caught flies on a stylus and watched the mirrors and waited for the day he had been told would be his last. The wet nurse, Phyllis, carrying his ashes to the temple of the Flavian family on the Quirinal, mixing them with those of his niece who had loved him when he was young, burying them herself because the palace had abandoned him the moment he was dead. This is the ending that the political story does not have room for. The human fact at the center of all the abstraction. The stars above the Palatine are the same stars that rose above it when the palace was complete and the corridors were polished and the flies were still alive, and the emperor was still alive, and everything had not yet happened that would happen. And the distance between that moment and this one is everything, and also in the way that only silence and ruins can make it almost nothing. The Palatine Hill is quieter now than it has been in 2,000 years. The marbles stripped away in the medieval period for other buildings. The great rooms open to the sky, the floor plans visible in the pattern of the surviving walls. And in the late afternoon, when the sun is low and the shadows are long, the ruins have a quality that the complete building could not have had, a beauty that comes from the distance between what was there and what remains. In that distance, in the space between the magnificent building and the broken stone, is the man himself, the emperor, who built half of Rome and made all of it afraid, who caught flies on a stylus in the afternoons, who walked the corridors watching the mirrors, who paid his soldiers and reformed his currency and prosecuted his governors and killed his senators and was afraid and made everyone else afraid and died alone with a dagger in his groin on a September afternoon when the astrologers had told him the morning was the dangerous time. History keeps finding these people interesting, not because their stories are comfortable, but because they are true. True in the specific way that only things that actually happened can be, without the consolations of fiction, without the resolutions that narrative usually provides. Domitian's story does not resolve. It simply stops on a specific day in a specific room, and everything that came after was built on the foundation of what he had done, whether the builders acknowledged it or not, whether his name was on the stones or chiseled away. The night is deep now. The ruins are still. The stars are turning their slow circles above the Palatine, and the city that replaced the one he ruled is sleeping in the same geography that has always been Rome. The same 7 hills, the same river curving toward the same sea. And somewhere in the weight of all that stone and all that history and all that accumulated silence is the shape of a man who was many things and was finally, on a September afternoon, simply human. Rest now. The stones will still be here in the morning, patient and indifferent, and holding more of the truth than any account of it can contain. The way that the past always holds more than we can recover from it, keeping its secrets and its facts with equal faithfulness, giving back only what we have, the patience and the skill and the honesty to ask for. And the night around all of this is very quiet, and Rome is sleeping, and the Palatine is dark, and the stars have been above it longer than any of the stories told beneath them. There is something that the hostile tradition does not adequately capture about the Rome that Domitian governed, and that is the experience of the people who were not senators. The legionary soldier on the Rhine frontier, the man who had signed up for 25 years of service and who was living in a stone barracks at the edge of the known world, eating army bread and training with his unit in the cold German mornings, experienced the Domitianic reign most concretely through the pay raise, the first increase in legionary base pay since Augustus had set the rate more than a century before, a concrete material improvement in his daily life that he would have felt immediately, and that would have formed his opinion of the emperor as surely as any philosophical argument. For the provincial population of the Eastern Empire, the vigorous prosecution of corrupt governors that was a consistent feature of Domitianic administration, the accounts of the emperor sitting personally in the courts, of his specific engagement with provincial lawsuits that came before the imperial tribunal, represented outcomes that affected real people in real ways. A provincial farmer who received justice against a corrupt landlord because the emperor had personally reviewed the case was not thinking about the senator in Rome who was afraid to speak at dinner. He was thinking that the system had worked for him. For the urban population of Rome itself, the reign was one of extraordinary public spectacle. The games and the entertainments and the building and the distribution, the night spectacles in the amphitheater lit by torch, the Greek-style athletics competitions in the new stadium, the distributions that accompanied the games. All of this was experienced as the generosity of a ruler who was investing in the city and its people in visible and tangible ways. And the people who filled the Circus Maximus on race days were not the people who worried about the delatores and the treason trials. They were watching the most impressive public entertainments the ancient world had produced, and they were doing it in buildings that their emperor had built. The complexity of this situation, in which the same reign was experienced as terror by one class of people and as spectacular generosity by another, is something that the literary tradition, written by and for the senatorial class, cannot adequately represent, and the incompleteness of the surviving evidence makes it difficult to fill in the other perspectives with the same texture and detail that Pliny and Tacitus provide for the senatorial experience. What the administrative record does preserve, in inscriptions and papyri and the legal decisions that filtered through into the later compilations of Roman law, is evidence of an emperor who was engaged with the machinery of governance in ways that the tyrant portrait cannot accommodate. The specific responses to petitions from cities and communities across the empire, the careful decisions about water rights and tax assessments and building programs in distant provinces, the attention to the grain supply that was the essential foundation of urban life in Rome. All of this reflects a man who was doing the work of governing even while the fear that would eventually destroy him was building. The grain supply management that Domitian pursued with consistent tension was one of the foundations of social stability in Rome. The unknowna, the imperial system for ensuring that the city's population was fed, required constant administrative attention, constant coordination between the Egyptian and North African harvests, and the shipping schedules, and the storage facilities, and the distribution system in Rome itself. And the evidence suggests that Domitian's administration performed this essential function competently enough, but the supply failures that had caused political crises under earlier emperors did not recur under his reign. The edict he issued restricting vineyard cultivation in the provinces, apparently responding to concern that too much agricultural land was being converted from grain to wine production, was never fully enforced and was quietly abandoned. But it reflects an emperor thinking about the long-term agricultural economics of the empire in a way that the simple portrait of the paranoid tyrant cannot contain. It is the act of someone trying to govern in a systemic way, attending to structural problems rather than only to immediate political threats. The currency reform that was one of his first acts as emperor and that he maintained throughout his reign was another systemic intervention. The stabilization of the silver content of the denarius at the standard his father had maintained was a decision with consequences throughout the economy. For the soldiers whose pay was denominated in silver, for the merchants whose transactions depended on reliable coinage, for the provincial taxpayers whose assessments were converted into coin at the prevailing rate, a stable currency was not an abstraction, but a material fact of daily economic life. The construction of the limes along the German frontier, the system of roads and forts and watchtowers that defined the boundary between Roman territory and the Germanic lands beyond, was one of the great military engineering achievements of the first century, and it was substantially Domitianic. The logic of the construction, the decision about where to place the line and how to defend it, reflected a strategic assessment of the empire's sustainable boundaries that Trajan would reject in his Dacian ambitions, and that subsequent emperors would in practice return to. Hadrian's Wall in Britain and the continued investment in the German limes were the acknowledgement, never stated explicitly, that the conservative frontier strategy associated with Domitian was the more durable strategic vision. The equestrian administrators, who were taking on increasing responsibility for provincial financial management during the Flavian period, represent another dimension of the Domitianic administrative legacy. The expansion of the equestrian class's role in governance, bringing men of talent who lacked senatorial birth into the management of the empire's finances, was part of a broader trend toward professionalization that the hostile literary tradition does not credit him with, but that the administrative record supports. The professional civil service that Hadrian would systematize was built on foundations the Flavian emperors had laid. The libraries that Domitian rebuilt and expanded after they had been damaged by the fire of 80 AD were both personal expressions of a genuine interest in literature and public institutions that served the educated population of Rome. The Palatine Library and the Atrium Libertatis collection were among the largest repositories of texts in the ancient world, and their maintenance and expansion represent an investment in the cultural infrastructure of the city that the hostile tradition, focused on the terror, finds no room to acknowledge. The specific question of Domitian's personal reading is one the sources address with an interest that suggests it was known and remarked upon at the time. Suetonius says he read Tiberius's private papers and secret files, and the image of the emperor reading the surveillance records of his most notorious predecessor has been interpreted as a kind of dark inspiration, one tyrant drawing from the methods of another. but it might equally be interpreted as a man trying to understand a situation that had some similarities to his own. The emperor, who was distrusted by the senatorial class, reading the account of another emperor, who had been distrusted by the senatorial class. Tiberius is the comparison that the sources most frequently reach for when they want to characterize Domitian. And the comparison is not entirely unfair. Both men had spent years in a subordinate position before acceding to power. Both had a difficult relationship with the Senate. Both presided over reigns in which the accusation of maestas, of treason against imperial dignity, became a tool of political management or persecution, depending on your perspective. Both were experienced as fear by the class that produced the historical record. But the comparison also reveals the limits of the literary tradition. Because Tiberius governed for 23 years in the first century of the Principate, when the memories of the Republic were still living, when the expectations of the senatorial class for its own role in governance had not yet been fully adjusted to the reality of imperial rule, and Domitian governed 60 years later, when those expectations had been modified by a generation of Flavian rule that had never pretended to the Congustan fictions as fully as the Julio-Claudians had. The question of Domitian's inner life, of what it was like to be him, is one the sources approach only through the lens of their own concerns, and the honest answer is that we cannot know. We can observe the behavior, and we can infer from the behavior something about the psychology, but the specific texture of the experience, the weight of the fears, and whatever satisfactions the position offered, the quality of the solitude, and what he made of it, these are things that even the most detailed ancient account cannot give us. What we can say is that he was alone in the specific way that absolute power produces its own absolute solitude, unable to form the reciprocal relationships of ordinary friendship, because reciprocity requires vulnerability, and vulnerability in his position was genuinely and not merely theoretically dangerous. The people around him all had reasons that his position created for them to manage him carefully rather than engage with him honestly. And in the space that this created, the space between the emperor and everyone else, lived the particular loneliness of the most powerful person in the room. The mirrors in the corridors, the flies on the stylus, the walks in the garden of the miniature hippodrome. All of these images from the ancient sources are images of a man filling that space with the small actions of a mind that could not rest, that was always processing, always anticipating, always aware of the gap between what it was told and what might be true. The exhaustion of that condition over 15 years must have been considerable, and yet the work continued. The dispatches went out, the courts convened, the frontier was managed, the grain arrived, the buildings rose, the games were held. The empire functioned in the specific, ordinary way that empires function when the administrative machinery is working, even when the political atmosphere is suffocating. This is perhaps the most unsettling thing about the Domitianic reign, that it was able to be both things simultaneously: a reign of genuine administrative competence and a reign of genuine political terror. That the same man who managed the Danube frontier and reformed the currency and built the most magnificent palace in the ancient world also created the conditions in which senators were afraid to speak at dinner, in which philosophers were expelled from the city, in which a trusted general could be killed for accumulated prestige. The coexistence of these things is what the literary tradition, with its clear categories of good emperor and bad emperor, finds most difficult to accommodate, and what the archaeological and administrative evidence, which preserves the works regardless of the character of the person who commissioned them, makes it impossible to entirely suppress the Rome that you would walk through if you could walk through it in 98. 10 years into his reign, would be the most architecturally impressive Rome had yet been. The new palace dominating the Palatine, the stadium providing a permanent home for the Greek-style games, the Forum taking shape in the space between the older forums, the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline rebuilt in the most elaborate style yet attempted, the roads and the aqueducts and the grain supply all functioning with the competence that sustained administration could achieve, the games and the spectacles and the distributions, maintaining the social compact between the emperor and the city's population. And underneath all of this, in the dinner conversations that stopped when a door opened, in the letters that were composed with an eye to who else might read them, in the expressions that men had learned to control, in the silences that accumulated in the Senate House and the corridors of the court, the fear, present and real, and shaping everything about how people moved through their world. Both things, the building and the fear, were equally real, equally characteristic, equally the product of the same reign and the same man, the Domitian who sat in the polished corridors of his palace, in the most magnificent structure the ancient world had produced, watching the reflections in the mirrors and catching flies on a stylus, was the same Domitian who dispatched competent governors to the provinces and reformed the currency and organized the frontier and built the limes. The two portraits come from the same person, and neither one is sufficient without the other. The last day of his reign was a Tuesday in September, the autumn light slanting across the marble of the Palatine, the city going about its business in the valleys below. And in the private apartments of the palace, a man was asking what time it was, waiting for the dangerous hour to pass, reading a document that someone had brought him, and dying in a struggle in his bedroom, bleeding on the floor he had laid. And before the day was over, the Senate had met and voted, and the chisels had begun their work. And before the week was over, Nerva was emperor. And before the year was over, the name of Domitian had been removed from the inscriptions on most of the buildings he had paid for and built. And before the decade was over, Trajan was fighting Decebalus in Dacia, using the roads Domitian had built and the strategic Domitian's 15 years of management had produced. And the empire continued, as empires do, built on the foundations of all the things that came before, including the things whose builders' names were no longer on the stones. The night is very quiet now. The Palatine is dark. The ruins hold the outline of the rooms where the most feared emperor of the 1st century spent his afternoons alone. And the city below is sleeping in the geography that has always been Rome. And the stars are the same stars, and the distance is everything and nothing. Rest now, the stones know what they know, and the silence knows the rest. And the night around this story is patient and deep and very still. The Flavian dynasty that Domitian concluded had transformed the Roman world in ways that neither Vespasian nor Titus nor Domitian had fully intended or could have anticipated. They had come to power as the practical men who cleaned up after the catastrophe of Nero and the Civil War. And they had, in 26 years of rule, from 69 to 96 AD, moved the Principate further in the direction of open autocracy than any dynasty since Augustus had established the form. Vespasian had been practical and gruff, and had maintained the republican fictions with a farmer's lack of ceremony that somehow made them easier to sustain. Titus had been charming enough and brief enough that his reign seemed in retrospect like a pause rather than a chapter. And Domitian had taken the logic of imperial power to its final conclusion and stripped away the fictions entirely, had demanded to be acknowledged as what he was, rather than as the first among equals that Augustus had carefully performed. This stripping away was in one sense simply honest. The emperor had always been what Domitian claimed to be, the source of all legitimate authority, the person whose will was the foundation of the law. the individual in whose person the entire weight of the empire's power was concentrated. Augustus had understood this, and had concealed it beneath a performance of republican modesty, so skilled that the fiction had served him and his successors for a century. Domitian had no patience for the performance, and his refusal to perform it was experienced by the senatorial class as tyranny. But the tyranny was in significant part the tyranny of telling the truth about what the Pyrenees situation was, rather than maintaining the comfortable lie that the situation was something else, which is not the usual meaning of tyranny, but which captures something real about the specific dynamic of his relationship with the class that judged him. The senatorial class needed the fiction because without it their dignity had no basis. They were, in reality, subordinates of the emperor, their offices and their honors dependent on his favor, their safety dependent on his restraint, their collective dignity a courtesy he extended rather than a right they possessed. And as long as he maintained the fiction that they were partners in governance, they could maintain the fiction that they were something other than subjects. When he stopped maintaining the fiction, they were confronted with the reality of what they were. And the hatred this produced was the hatred of people who had been shown something they did not want to see. Tacitus understood this dynamic with the clarity of a very intelligent man who had lived inside it. And the annals and the histories he wrote in the Trigenic period are in large measure an attempt to work through the implications of what he had understood, to ask what political liberty actually required and what the conditions were under which something resembling it could be maintained inside a system that was structurally autocratic, to find in the history of the first century of the Principate the lessons that might inform the management of power in a way that was at least less destructive than what he had experienced. The answer he arrived at, imperfectly and through the specific tragedies he documented, was something like the Augustan answer, that the forms of republican participation needed to be maintained, even if the substance had been hollowed out, that the emperor who respected the Senate's dignity, even as he exercised all the real power, was more stable and less destructive than the emperor who acknowledged the reality of his autocracy, that the fiction was functional in ways that the truth was not. This was not a satisfying philosophical conclusion, but it was a practical one. And the Antonine period that followed Domitian's death worked according to exactly this logic. Trajan and Hadrian and Antoninus, Pius and Marcus Aurelius all maintained the fiction with varying degrees of skill, treated the Senate as a partner in governance while retaining all the real decision-making authority, and were rewarded with the judgment of the literary tradition that they were the best emperors Rome had known. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor who wrote the Meditations in his private journal during the German campaigns of the 170s AD, was trying to internalize exactly the lesson that Domitian's reign had demonstrated from the outside. The emperor must be the servant of his people rather than their master, must maintain his inner freedom through philosophical practice, must recognize that the exercise of power over others was not the foundation of virtue, but the most difficult test of it. The Meditations are the private record of a man trying to be the emperor that Domitian had refused to pretend to be. But they are private. They are a journal kept for the emperor's own use and not for public consumption. And the fact that they are private tells you that Marcus Aurelius also understood what Domitian had failed to understand, that some things need to be kept to yourself if you want to maintain the position that lets you act on your convictions, that the performance is necessary even when you know it is a performance, that the fiction is functional even when you know it is a fiction. The buildings that Domitian built survived the damnatio because buildings cannot be erased the way names can. The palace on the Palatine continued to be the residence of the emperors for 3 centuries after his death. Every emperor, from Nerva to Constantine, lived in the rooms he had built. conducted their audiences in the chamber whose ceiling was designed to make them seem enormous, dined in the hall that Statius had praised as larger than the sky. And eventually the palace became so identified with the office itself that Palatium, Palatine, became the word for the residence of every ruler in every language derived from Latin. Palace in English, palazzo in Italian, palais in French, palacio in Spanish. All of these words carry the trace of the building that Domitian built on the hill that had always been the heart of Rome. The stadium in the Campus Martis, whose shape the Piazza Navona preserves, is another of his buildings that outlasted the condemnation of his memory. The shape of the space is Domitianic, even though no sign in the piazza acknowledges it. The buildings that line the oval were built along the curve of the ancient seating, and the central space where the tourists and the Romans sit at cafe tables and watch the fountains is the space where the athletes competed in the Capitoline Games. The forum that bears Nerva's name was substantially his, and the colonnade and the temple of Minerva that were its most distinctive features were recognized as among the finest public architecture of the imperial period by observers who were not necessarily interested in crediting their patron. The quality of the design outlasted the suppression of the designer's name. This persistence of the work through the condemnation of the worker is one of the most instructive things about the Domitianic legacy. The things he built were good enough to survive the people who hated him, solid enough to bear the weight of successors who wanted to use them but not to credit them, permanent enough to carry the traces of their origin into the present, even when the present has no particular interest in acknowledging where they came from. The Roman Empire that Domitian governed at its height covered approximately 5 million square kilometers. It encompassed the entire Mediterranean basin and extended north to Britain and the Rhine and the Danube, east to the Euphrates, south to the edge of the Sahara. Within these boundaries lived perhaps 60 to 70 million people of dozens of languages and hundreds of local cultures, governed through a network of perhaps 600 cities, administered by a bureaucracy that was large by ancient standards and small by modern ones, held together by roads and laws and the universal availability of the denarius and the universal threat of the legions. From the palace on the Palatine, you could not see any of this. You could see Rome and the hills around it. Everything else was a report, a letter, a petition, an ambassador, a number on a papyrus document. The empire that Domitian governed was in most of its reality invisible to him, present only as the information that flowed toward the center and the decisions that flowed back out. The experience of being at the center of an information system of this scale, making decisions whose effects you cannot directly observe, governing a world you will mostly never see, is one that the ancient sources do not help much to reconstruct, because it was so much the normal condition of imperial governance that no one thought it worth describing. The emperor received reports and made decisions, and the consequences played out at a distance. And the gap between decision and consequence, between intention and effect, was as invisible to him as the provinces themselves. What he could see was Rome, and Rome he saw with complete clarity. The politics of the city, the state of the senatorial class, the mood of the people at the games, the condition of the buildings and the streets and the water supply. All of this was immediate and observable. And the gap between his management of the city he could see and his management of the empire he could not see is probably one of the factors in the specific form that his anxieties took, concentrating on the political threat closest to him because it was the threat he could see most clearly. The Danube crisis of 85 AD, when Decebalus's forces crossed the river and killed the Roman governor of Mysia, was news that arrived in Rome weeks after the event, carried by military couriers along the road network at the fastest speed available. And the campaigns that Domitian organized in response played out over the following years at a distance he could never directly observe. His decisions about force levels and commanders and strategic objectives were made on the basis of reports that were always weeks old and never fully accurate. The management of a frontier crisis from the center of the empire in the 1st century AD was an exercise in sustained uncertainty that modern readers, accustomed to instantaneous communication, find genuinely difficult to imagine. The eastern frontier and its management was another dimension of the reign that the literary tradition, focused on the domestic terror, gives inadequate attention to. The relationship with Parthia, the great power to Rome's east, was managed throughout Domitian's reign through a combination of diplomatic activity and military readiness that maintained peace on a frontier that could be catastrophically expensive when it was not at peace. The stability of the eastern frontier during his reign was not an accident or a default. It was the product of sustained diplomatic and military management that the historical record acknowledges inadequately. The provincial cities of the Eastern Empire, the Greek-speaking urban centers of Asia Minor and Syria and Egypt, that were the most economically productive and culturally sophisticated parts of the empire, prospered during Domitian's reign in ways that the prescriptions and the archaeological evidence make visible even when the literary sources are not interested in describing them. The cities of the Ionian coast, Ephesus and Smyrna and Pergamon and the others, were building and trading and producing the philosophical and literary culture that made the Greek East the intellectual center of the Roman world. And they were doing this within a framework of imperial administration that Domitian's government maintained with sufficient competence to allow their prosperity to continue. The specific cultural interactions between Roman imperial power and Greek intermexial tradition that characterized the Antonine period. The 2nd century, when Greek philosophers and rhetoricians were prominent in the imperial court, and when the dialogue between Roman power and Greek thought was at its most productive, were built on the foundation of a century of Flavian administration that had taken the eastern provinces seriously as a source of revenue and culture, rather than merely as a frontier to be defended. The second sophistic, the flowering of Greek rhetorical and literary culture in the 2nd century AD, was in some ways the delayed fruit of the Flavian period's systematic engagement with the Greek East. The Greek intellectuals who would flourish under Hadrian and the Antonines were being educated in the cities that the Flavian administration had allowed to prosper and had, in some cases, patronized directly. The cultural investment paid returns that the investors could not have anticipated, and that the literary tradition has not always been careful to trace back to its origins. The library that the city of Ephesus built in the early 2nd century AD, the Library of Celsus, whose facade survives magnificently to this day, was built during the Trigenic period but reflects the cultural confidence of a city that had prospered through the Flavian period and that was now expressing that prosperity in the most visible and permanent form available. The building of libraries and theaters and colonnaded streets that characterize the 2nd century Greek East was the cultural expression of an economic security that the imperial administration had helped to create and maintain. The roads that connected all of this together, the roads that Domitian built and maintained as part of his systematic attention to the empire's infrastructure, were not mere convenience, but the physical foundation of everything the empire was. Trade and military movement and administrative communication and cultural exchange all depended on roads that were maintained and safe and fast. And the Domitianic investment in road infrastructure across the empire, documented in the inscriptions on milestones and in the administrative records of road construction, was one of the most durable contributions of the reign to the physical and economic fabric of the empire. The milestones that marked the roads of the Roman Empire, the stone columns set at regular intervals indicating distance to the nearest major city, were one of the most systematic physical expressions of Roman administrative order. And on many of them Domitian's name was inscribed, and on many of them it was later chiseled away, and the milestones with the blank spaces, or the successors, name added over the erasure, are scattered across the former empire in numbers large enough to tell you something about the scale of the road-building program that was done in his name and then unnamed. A man who builds roads, and the roads outlast the condemnation of his name, is a man whose practical achievement has survived his political defeat, which is a kind of immortality that is less glamorous than the immortality of the heroes, but more durable than the immortality of the feared. The Flavian amphitheater, the Colosseum, still stands in the center of Rome, still drawing millions of visitors a year, still one of the most recognized buildings in the world, and the contributions that Domitian made to it are part of its structure, even though the monument is not associated with his name in the popular consciousness. The fourth tier, and the basement system, and the wooden arena, floor under which the wild animals and the gladiators waited, are the Domitianic contributions to a building that everyone knows, but whose full history of construction very few people think about. The building is not his, and it is not his. It is a Flavian building, and he was a Flavian, and the dynasty's largest project reflects the full dynasty's contributions, which is the most accurate thing you can say about it, and the least satisfying, because it assigns credit to a category rather than to a person, and loses the specific person inside the category. The specific person is what we have been trying to recover throughout this story, and the recovery is always partial, always mediated through sources that had their own purposes and their own blind spots, always incomplete in the way that the recovery of any historical person. The person is always more than the evidence, and the evidence is always more than we can fully read. What we can read is enough to know that he was real, that he was not merely the tyrant of the literary tradition or the misunderstood administrator of the revisionist tradition, but a person who was simultaneously both and who was also many other things that neither portrait captures. A man who was afraid and who made others afraid, and who built magnificently, and who was murdered in his bedroom, and whose nurse buried him quietly, and whose name was erased from the stones, and whose buildings survived the erasure, the Palatine Hill at night, with the city below it, and the stars above it, and the ruins spread across its summit in the shapes of the rooms that were there, and the spaces between the rooms that were also there, is as honest an account of him as the record will support. The scale of what he built is still legible. The absence of what was there is also still legible. And the combination of the scale and the absence is as close as we can come to the truth of what he was. The night is deepening now. The city is quiet in the way that large cities are quiet very late. The noise settling into a background murmur that is the sound of 1,000,000 people breathing and dreaming in their separate rooms. The Tiber moving in the darkness toward the sea. The 7 hills holding their ancient shapes against the sky, and the Palatine among them. The oldest and the most storied and the most thoroughly built upon and the most thoroughly ruined, keeping in its broken stone the shape of everything that was placed on it across 25 centuries of human occupation. The kings and the republic, and the emperors, and the medieval foragers, and the Renaissance gardens, and the archaeologists who came after, each era leaving its mark on top of the previous era's marks, until the hill is a palimpsest of human ambition so layered and so compressed that separating the layers is a lifetime's work for specialists, and still leaves more unknown than known. Domitian is somewhere in those layers. not just in the ruins of his palace, but in the shape of the hill itself. In the decisions made about where to build, and where not to build, and how to organize the summit, and how to relate the structures on it to the city below, decisions that shaped everything that came after, that made the Palatine what it is in a physical sense that persists regardless of whose name is on the inscriptions. This is the legacy that the damnatio could not touch, the physical shape of the world as a consequence of the decisions made inside it, the traces that remain not because they were preserved intentionally, but because stone and earth and the stubborn persistence of physical reality are more durable than the political decisions of any single moment. The stars above the Palatine have been there longer than Rome, and will be there when Rome is as thoroughly forgotten as Ur or Akkad, or the cities of the Indus Valley, whose names we do not know. They are indifferent to the question of whose name is on which inscription, and whether the name was chiseled away, and what the chisel said about the person whose name it removed. The indifference of the stars is not cold. It is simply honest about the scale of things. And honest about scale is the most we can ask of anything when we are trying to understand what the past was and what it means. What the past was is everything that happened. What it means is what we make of it. And what we make of it changes as we change. And the change is the thing that makes the study of it worthwhile. Not the answers, which are always partial and always provisional, but the practice of asking, which is the most specifically human thing we do, the most specifically human and the most enduring. The night holds all of this without judgment. The ruins hold it in their broken stone, and the city below the Palatine is sleeping in its ancient geography, and the river is moving toward the sea. And somewhere in the layers of the hill, the shape of a man who was afraid, not as memory, not as record, but as consequence, as the physical shape of a world that was made differently because he was in it. Rest now. The stone is patient with the night, and the night is patient with the years. And the years have been accumulating since long before any of this was built, and they will go on accumulating long after the last stone has been carried away. And in that accumulation, somewhere, is the truth of everything that matter, including this, including him. The question of how an empire maintains itself across generations is one that the Romans themselves thought about with a seriousness that the literary tradition preserves, even when the political circumstances distorted the answers. The idea of the res publica, the public thing, the thing that belonged to all the citizens rather than to any individual, was an idea that had survived the Republic's actual collapse precisely because it served the emperor's need for legitimacy, as well as it had served the Republic's need for civic identity. Domitian's rejection of this idea, his insistence on the dominus et deus formulation, his refusal to perform the deference to senatorial dignity that made the res publica fiction functionally useful, was in part a philosophical position about what the empire actually was, a position not entirely wrong, but entirely counterproductive, because the functional usefulness of the fiction was precisely what you were destroying when you called it a fiction. The Augustan insight that founded the Principate was the insight that power is most stable when its reality is partly concealed, that institutions which acknowledge their own fictionality are less durable than institutions which maintain their fictions with conviction, that the performance of republican virtue by the emperor was not merely hypocrisy but a functional requirement of the system, because without the performance, the senatorial class had no basis for the self-respect Domitian had seen too clearly to perform convincingly. And the clarity that made the performance impossible was the same clarity that made him dangerous as a political operator. He understood exactly what the situation was, and exactly who threatened him, and exactly what they were thinking. And this understanding, without the social intelligence to manage it, The ability to make people feel safe, even when they were not, was the combination that produced the reign the sources describe. The social intelligence that Augustus had, possessed in abundance, and that made him the most successful political operator in Roman history, was the ability to make very powerful people feel respected while giving them nothing real, to honor the forms of collective decision-making while making all decisions himself, to perform humility so convincingly that even people who knew he was performing could not quite bring themselves to resent it. This combination of intelligence and performance, of genuine insight and the willingness to use that insight to maintain useful fictions, is one of the rarer political gifts, and Augustus had it, and Domitian did not. What Domitian had instead was a different kind of intelligence. The intelligence of someone who understood systems and could manage them, who could see administrative problems clearly and solve them competently, who could assess military situations accurately and respond to them appropriately, who could identify a political threat before it fully developed and attempt to neutralize it. This was genuine intelligence of a kind that produced real results in the domains where it was applied. But it was not the social intelligence that the management of the Principate specifically required. And the gap between what he had and what the position needed was what produced the tragedy. The historian reading the Domitianic period from the distance of 2,000 years sees both the competence and the fear simultaneously, can hold both things without needing to resolve them into a simpler judgment, can acknowledge the administrative achievement without denying the political terror, can acknowledge the genuine capability of the man without dismissing the genuine suffering of the people he harmed. And this more complicated holding is probably the most honest relationship with the historical record that is available to us. The men and women who lived through the reign did not have the luxury of this distance. They were inside the thing rather than looking at it from the outside, and their experience of it was shaped by where they stood inside it. The senator who was afraid to speak at dinner and the legionary soldier on the Danube who had just received a pay raise were inside the same reign and experiencing genuinely different things, and both their experiences were true. The truth of a historical period is always multiple rather than singular. It is the sum of all the experiences being had simultaneously in all the different positions relative to the events, and the power and the systems that define the period. And the literary tradition's account is always only some of those experiences, the ones that happen to be recorded by people with the education and the access and the preservation of their records that allowed them to survive. And the incompleteness is not a failure, but a fact about what human record-keeping is and has always been. What we have of Domitian is what has survived, shaped by the people who survived it, and by the purposes that shaped their accounts, and by the accidents of preservation that kept some texts and lost others. And from this partial and shaped record we try to reconstruct something honest about what happened and who was responsible for it, what it means for the questions we are still trying to answer about power and liberty and the conditions of human flourishing. The questions are the same questions that the Romans were asking in 97 AD when Tacitus sat down to write the same questions that Marcus Aurelius was trying to answer in his private journal on the Danube frontier in the 170s. The same questions that every generation tries to answer with whatever tools and whatever evidence the previous generation has left them. The questions do not resolve, but the asking of them changes us, makes us more capable of the next round of asking. And this cumulative capability, however partial and however incomplete, is what we mean when we say that history matters. The ruins on the Palatine are part of the evidence for the questions, not as answers, but as provocations, as concrete demonstrations that the questions have been asked before in specific places by specific people who were working with specific constraints and whose partial and imperfect answers we have inherited, along with the ruins of the places where they were working. The specific place where Domitian was working. The palace on the Palatine that was the most ambitious architectural expression of imperial autocracy in the history of Rome, is now open sky and broken concrete, and the tourist walkways of the Palatine Archaeological Park, where you can walk through the ruins of the rooms and see the scale of what was there and imagine the marble that is gone and the ceiling that was impossibly high and the throne at the end of the audience chamber and the emperor sitting on it watching the petitioners come across the floor. The imagining is part of what the ruins are for. They exist to be imagined into, to provide the concrete framework within which the historical imagination can operate. They are more honest than reconstructions because they preserve the absence as well as the presence, the scale of what is missing as well as the scale of what remains. And in that preserved absence is something that pure description or pure reconstruction cannot provide. The sense of time passing and things being lost and the incompleteness that is the actual condition of historical knowledge. The emperor who sat on the throne in that chamber is as incompletely recovered as the chamber itself. We have the outline and some of the detail and large areas of absence where the evidence did not survive or was deliberately destroyed. And the figure we can reconstruct from this incomplete evidence is a figure with gaps in it, spaces where we cannot see clearly, where the record runs out or contradicts itself, or was shaped by purposes that prevent its transparent use. The gaps are part of the figure. They are not failures of the reconstruction. They are honest acknowledgments of what the evidence permits. And the honesty of the gaps is part of what makes the exercise of historical reconstruction worth doing. It keeps us from the false confidence of thinking we know more than we do, from the false tidiness of the simple stories that are easier to tell but less true. Domitian was many things, and all of them were real. And the real is always more complicated than the story we tell about it. And the story we tell about it is always part of how we understand ourselves, as well as how we understand the past. And that double function of historical story, looking backward and forward simultaneously, is what makes the telling worth the effort. The night is very late now. The city below the Palatine is as quiet as a city of this size ever gets. The last cafe tables have been cleared, and the last buses have run their routes, and the last tourists have gone back to their hotels, and the city is breathing in its sleep. 1.5 million people dreaming in the geography that has been Rome for 27 centuries, and above them the Palatine is dark and still and holding in its broken stone all the lives that were lived on it, and all the decisions that were made on it, and all the fear, and the competence, and the building, and the terror, and the solitude that was Domitian's reign. And above the Palatine the stars are the stars they have always been, indifferent and clear and turning in their slow circles that will go on turning long after the last stone from the palace has been carried away for some other purpose. The world is very quiet, and the distance between then and now is everything. And in that distance, if you are patient with it, if you let the silence do its work, you can almost feel the weight of all those years pressing down gently like the dark, like the particular dark that comes very late when the city is finally quiet. The women of Domitian's Rome moved through the historical record in the way that most women move through ancient historical records, as occasional presences rather than sustained subjects, visible when they intersected with the stories of men and invisible the rest of the time, which was most of the time the Empress Domitia Longina, whom Domitian had married in 70 AD after she left her first husband at his request, is one of the more enigmatic figures of the reign. The sources describe their relationship as complicated. There were rumors that Domitian had killed an actor she was attached to. Rumors that she had participated in the conspiracy that killed him. Rumors that she had been temporarily divorced and then taken back. All of which paint a picture of a marriage that was not conventionally harmonious, but that was also clearly more than a formal arrangement. Domitia survived the reign, survived the condemnation of her husband's memory, survived the reign of Nerva, and then Trajan, and continued to live into the reign of Hadrian, dying at an advanced age and leaving behind an inscription on a water pipe that mentions her as the owner of a villa in the area of Geta that is one of the documentary traces of her continued existence. In the world after the palace years were over, the empress, who may or may not have helped kill her husband, outliving him by 40 years and leaving behind a pipe inscription, which is the kind of ending that history provides, rather than the kind that narrative would prefer. The niece whose ashes Phyllis mixed with Domitian's was Julia, daughter of his brother Titus, who had lived in the imperial household and who had died young. The sources hint at a relationship between uncle and niece that was closer than it should have been, and that contributed to her death, though the specifics are obscured by the hostile tradition's interest in maximum scandal. What is clear is that she died young, and that Domitian mourned her, and that the wet nurse who buried him chose to bury him with her, which suggests that the bond between them was real enough to matter at the moment of final disposition. The servant boy who was kept out of the room during the assassination, who had been assigned to bring the emperor a weapon, and whose absence was part of the plan, is present in the sources only as a function in the narrative of Domitian's death. His name is not recorded. His subsequent life is unknown. He was a child who was used as part of a conspiracy to kill the man he served, and who grew up, presumably, in a world that had changed completely from the one he had been born into. The reign of a different emperor, the rehabilitation of the senatorial class, the buildings still standing but the name erased from them, the administrative staff who continued from the Domitianic to the Nervan to the Trajanic administration without interruption, the freedmen secretaries and the equestrian financial officers and the military, tribunes and the provincial governors' staffs. All of these people navigated the transition from one emperor to the next in the way that professional administrators always navigate such transitions, by continuing to do the work that needed to be done and by adjusting their expressed opinions about their previous employer to match the expectations of their current one. This continuity of administration across the change of dynasty is one of the things that made the Roman Empire durable in a way that purely personal regimes are not. The work of governing was embedded in institutions and procedures and professional knowledge that survived individual transitions, even when the individuals themselves did not. And the specific institutions and procedures that Domitian had refined continued to function after his death under the names of the successors, who had not created them but who benefited from them. The lawyers who were developing Roman jurisprudence during the Flavian and Antonine periods, the great jurists whose work would eventually be codified in Justinian's Digest in the 6th century AD, and whose legal thinking has shaped the legal systems of most of the modern world, were working in a context that the imperial system had created, and that the specific administrative attention to law and legal procedure that characterized the Flavian period had reinforced. The Domitianic attention to the courts was part of the environment within which this legal development was occurring, part of the signal that legal reasoning mattered and that the emperor was paying attention to it. The Roman law that survives in Justinian's compilation and that was rediscovered by medieval European scholars in the 11th and 12th centuries, and that became the foundation of the civil law tradition that governs most of continental Europe and Latin America today, is not a Domitianic legacy in any direct sense. but it was developing in the period of Domitianic governance, being worked on by lawyers who were operating within the administrative context he had helped to shape, and the specific contributions of the Flavian period to the development of Roman legal procedure and administration are part of the larger story of how Roman law became what it became. The Roman roads that Domitian built and maintained are long gone as functional infrastructure, but their lines are preserved in the landscape in the way that roads always leave their traces, in the straight alignments of later paths and tracks that followed the engineered surfaces of the Roman originals, in the place names along the routes that preserve corrupted forms of Roman words, in the archaeological traces of the road construction itself that excavation reveals in sections of still preserved road surface, and the drainage ditches that flanked the metalled surface, and the milestones that marked the distances, the Appian Way south of Rome, the Via Flaminia north of it, the Via Aurelia along the Tyrrhenian coast. All of these roads were maintained and in some cases improved during the Domitianic period, and their continued functional use through the medieval and early modern periods into the present, in the form of the roads that follow or parallel their routes, is a kind of physical continuity that is more durable than any inscription and more honest about what actually persists from the past than any literary tradition. The aqueducts that brought water to Rome from the hills and mountains northeast and southeast of the city were another form of infrastructure that required constant maintenance, and that Domitian's administration managed with the competence that such systems require if they are to continue functioning. The water that flowed through the pipes of the Palatine Palace, through the fountains in the great dining room and the garden hippodrome, through the baths and the kitchens and the utility spaces of the palace complex, was brought from sources miles away through a system of engineering that was one of the great practical achievements of Roman civilization. The 9 aqueducts serving Rome in the 1st century AD provided something in the range of 1 million cubic meters of water per day to a city of 1 million people, a supply that by modern standards of water use is modest, that allowed the public baths and the public fountains and the private supplies of the wealthy to function at a level of abundance that no other city in the ancient world could match. And this abundance was not self-maintaining. It required constant inspection and repair and management, and the political will to fund the maintenance. The curator aquarum, the official responsible for the maintenance of Rome's aqueduct system, was one of the important administrative positions of the imperial government, and the care with which this position was managed under different emperors is one of the practical measures of administrative competence that does not make it into the literary tradition, but that affected the daily life of Rome's population more directly than most of what the literary tradition does preserve. The water flowed through the reign of Domitian as it had through the reigns of his predecessors, and as it would flow through the reigns of his successors, indifferent to the political dramas being played out at the center, continuing to perform its function because the systems that delivered it were maintained, and because the people who maintained them continued to do their work regardless of who was on the throne. This is the most ordinary and the most essential truth about the Roman Empire and about empires in general, that they function because most of the work of keeping them functioning is done by people who are not in the sources and not in the histories, but who are managing the systems that make everything else possible. The water officials and the road inspectors and the grain managers and the harbor masters and the customs collectors and the provincial tax assessors, all of these people doing their work across the reigns of the memorable and the forgotten emperors alike, keeping the water flowing and the roads passable and the grain arriving and the money moving. Domitian was one of the memorable emperors, remembered for the wrong reasons primarily, but remembered And the work of all those anonymous people was what made his memorable reign possible, was what kept the empire functioning while he was managing the politics of the senatorial class and the frontier crises and the personal fears that eventually consumed him. The light that comes before dawn on the Palatine comes first to the top of the hill and then moves down the slopes as the sun clears the horizon to the east. And in that early light, the ruins of the palace look different than they look in the full light of day, softer and more complete somehow, as if the restoration of the marble and the painted walls is more possible in the transitional light when the eye adjusts slowly from dark to bright and the shapes it sees are not fully resolved into their actual condition. In that transitional light, you can almost see it as it was. The scale of the rooms, and the height of the ceilings, and the depth of the colors in the stone and the morning. Movement of the people who lived and worked there. The servants and the administrators and the guards and the secretaries, walking the colonnades in the early morning when the city below was just beginning to wake. Looking out over Rome and toward the hills and whatever was on his mind in that specific hour, the specific hour before the day's demands began, when a person is most honestly themselves, when the performances required by the day have not yet started, and the person is still in the liminal space between the private and the public. That hour on the Palatine in the morning when the most feared man in the world was just a man in the early light, looking at a city he could see and an empire he could not. What he thought in those moments is beyond recovery, but the moments were real. They happened in the specific place whose ruins you can stand in the specific light that still comes at the same time from the same direction, in the specific early morning silence of Rome that is as close to quiet as a city of its size and history can get. The ruins hold that silence now, and they hold the accumulated silence of all the mornings since the palace was whole, and all the mornings before it was built, come after the last stone has been taken away. The silence of ruins is a specific kind of silence, different from the silence of empty spaces and different from the silence of natural places. It is a silence that is full of everything that was said there and everything that is now full of the conversations that have been gone for so long they are not even echoes anymore, present only as the shapes of the rooms they happened in. In that silence, the history that we have been trying to recover across this long night is not recovered, but it is close. Closer than it gets in the daytime when the tourists are there, and the guides are explaining, and the audio tour is playing in someone's ear. Closer in the early morning, before all of that, when the silence is most complete, and the shapes of the rooms are most legible, and the distance between then and now is at its smallest. The distance is still enormous. 20 centuries is 20 centuries. And the person who lived in those rooms is as remote, but the rooms are there, and the hill is there, and the light is there, and the silence is there. And in all of that, there-ness is something that is not the past, but is as close to the past as the present can get, which is probably enough, which is what history is, the present's best approximation of the there-ness of what is gone. The ruins are lightening now in the early sun. The city below is beginning to stir, and the emperor who made Rome quiet is as quiet as the ruins that survive him. Rest now. The morning will come to whatever darkness you are in, and the stones will still be there when it does, and the silence will still be there, and somewhere in the silence, if you are very still, is everything that happened, everything that was built, everything that was feared, and the long patience of the stone that outlasts all of it, and the stars above the stone turning still, and the light coming in from the east, as it always has, as it always will. Sleep well the morning after. Domitian's death was the first morning in 15 years that certain men in Rome woke up and did not immediately think about what they had to be. careful about today. It was a small thing and an enormous thing simultaneously. The senators who had learned to control their expressions, who had trained themselves to receive bad news without flinching, who had practiced the management of their own faces the way other men practiced oratory or swordsmanship. These men woke up on the morning of September 19th in 96 AD, and the first habit of their minds reached for the familiar anxiety and found it gone, or found that the particular shape of it had changed into something different, something that would take time to learn to live without. Freedom from fear is its own adjustment, its own process. The muscles that have been held tense for 15 years do not immediately relax when the cause of the tension is removed. They hold the tension out of habit for a while. And the men who had survived the Domitianic court by being very careful did not immediately stop being careful. The care had become part of how they moved through the world, and it would take time to learn a different way of moving. Pliny the Younger wrote about this adjustment in his letters with the precision of a man who was genuinely trying to understand his own psychology. The experience of writing freely after years of writing carefully, of saying what he actually thought after years of managing what he allowed himself to say, was an experience he returned to repeatedly, trying to capture something that was genuinely difficult to articulate, the specific texture of a liberty that had been absent long enough to have been partially forgotten. The letters that Pliny wrote in the years after Domitian's death are among the most personal and most revealing documents of the period. Not just for what they say about the Domitianic experience, but for what they reveal about the man doing the remembering. A man who was complicated and self-aware and not always flattering in his own self-portrait, who knew that he had been careful when courage might have been more honorable, and who was trying to understand what that had cost him and what it had cost the people around him. Tacitus was doing something more ambitious in the same period. He was trying to understand the structural conditions that had produced the Domitianic experience, to trace through the history of the Principate from Augustus onward the development of the conditions that had made the terror of the late 1st century possible, to write the history of Roman freedom's decline in a way that would allow future generations to understand what had been lost and what had been preserved and what it would take to prevent the worst from recurring. The Agricola, written quickly in the first year after Domitian's death, was the warm-up, the personal meditation on the moral costs of survival, the tribute to a man who had navigated the impossible choice between service and integrity with more grace than most, the statement of what Tacitus valued in public life and why he valued it. The histories and the annals, written over the following 2 decades, were the larger project, the systematic account of how the Principate had developed from Augustus through the Flavians, told in a prose style whose compression and irony and moral weight were themselves a product of what the Domitianic period had done to a man who cared about words and what they could do. The irony that the most politically destructive reign of the 1st century produced the greatest historian Rome ever had, one of those ironies that history produces regularly, and that reveals something real about the relationship between adversity and achievement. Tacitus needed what the Domitianic experience gave him, needed the specific pressure and the specific moral seriousness and the specific practice of saying things carefully that it forced on him, to produce the work that he produced. And the work is genuinely great, genuinely among the most powerful historical writing in any language. And it would not have been what it was without the experience that shaped it. This does not mean the Domitianic terror was good because it produced great literature. The argument works the other way. The literature is great because it was written by a man great enough to make something permanently valuable out of an experience that was genuinely terrible. And what it made was an account of the terrible experience, honest and searching enough to illuminate not just that specific experience, but the conditions of political life more broadly, which is what the best historical writing has always done. The question of what we take from history, what we are supposed to take, what the enterprise is for, is one that every historian eventually has to answer. And the answers vary as much as historians do. But something in the best of them converges on the proposition that history is most useful not as a source of lessons, because the lessons are always too simple for the complexity of the situations they are supposed to illuminate, but as a practice of attention, of sitting with the record of what actually happened and trying to understand it as honestly as the evidence permits. The honest understanding does not resolve into simple judgments. It holds the complexity without forcing it into the shapes that simple judgments require. It acknowledges that the same person can be both competent and cruel, both genuinely capable and genuinely destructive, both the builder of things that last and the destroyer of people who matter, and that these things do not cancel each other out, but coexist in the specific person, in the specific situation, doing specific things in specific moments. Domitian coexists in the record as all of these things, and the coexistence is uncomfortable and honest, and the most accurate relationship with the evidence that the evidence permits. And the discomfort is not a problem to be solved, but a feature of the honest engagement with a life that was genuinely complicated in ways that the hostile tradition and the revisionist tradition both flatten in different directions. The specific flattenings tell us something about the purposes they serve. The hostile tradition flattening toward tyrant because the senatorial class needed the tyrant category to make sense of what they had experienced and to justify the damnatio they had voted. The revisionist tradition flattening toward misunderstood administrator because modern historians needed to push back against the uncritical acceptance of the hostile tradition and to show that administrative evidence could complicate the literary portrait. Both flattenings are partial truths in service of larger arguments. And the larger arguments are real arguments worth making. The senatorial tradition's argument about political liberty is a real argument, and it deserved to be made, and it has shaped political thinking in the Western world in ways that matter. And the modern historiographical argument about reading ancient evidence critically is also a real argument, and it has improved our understanding of the Roman imperial period in ways that matter. And when both arguments have been heard and weighed, the person at the center of them is still there, still more complicated than either argument can fully contain, still asking from the record something that the record can only partially give, the kind of full understanding of a human life that none of us can give to any other human life, even the lives we observe directly and at close range. The ruins are the most honest response to this limitation. They are what remains when the arguments and the interpretations and the hostile traditions and the revisionist corrections have all said what they have to say. The physical facts of what was built and what has survived. The shape of the rooms and the scale of the ambition and the absence of the marble that is gone. The blank spaces on the stones where the name was removed and the name of a successor added in its place, and the blank spaces and the substituted names and the ruins themselves are all part of the same record, all part of what happened, all part of the truth that the evidence holds imperfectly and incompletely and more honestly than any account of it can quite manage. The city of Rome has been continuously inhabited for 27 centuries. Which makes it one of the longest continuously inhabited cities in the world. And in that continuous habitation, the layers of the past are not separate and sequential, but mixed. A medieval church built from the stones of a Roman temple, which was built on the foundations of a republican sanctuary, which was built on the site of an archaic altar, And in the middle of all of this, the Palatine Hill, the oldest part of the city, and the most thoroughly built upon, and the most thoroughly ruined, keeping in its layered stone the accumulated history of all those centuries of human presence. The emperor who added his layer to that accumulation, the most ambitious and the most architecturally overwhelming layer that any single person had yet added to the hill, is present in the stones even where his name is absent, present in the dimensions of the rooms and the engineering of the foundations and the organization of the spaces and the relationship of the whole to the city below. All of this is his, even without the name. All of this persists regardless of what the Senate voted in September of 96 AD. The persistence is not justice. It is not a correction of the damnatio or a rehabilitation of the condemned. It is just the stubbornness of physical reality in the face of political intention. The buildings outlasted the condemnation, not because the buildings deserved to outlast it, but because buildings do not respond to senatorial votes in the way that inscriptions do. And this stubbornness of the physical, this indifference of the material world to human judgments about it, is one of the things that the study of material culture and archaeology adds to the study of history from texts alone. It complicates the record in ways that are honest because the complication is real. The buildings were there, and they were built by someone, and the someone was Domitian, and that is true regardless of what the Senate voted. The night has been very long, and the story has been very long, and the man at the center of it has remained throughout as complicated as he actually was, which is the most that can be asked of this kind of attempt at historical understanding. Not the resolution of the complexity, but the honest dwelling in it. The patient attendance to what the evidence actually shows, rather than what we would like it to show. The city below the Palatine is fully awake now, in whatever morning you are moving toward, or already in. The sounds of Rome that began as a murmur in the early hours have grown to the full noise of a city in the day, and the Palatine above it is open to the tourists and the archaeologists and the people who just want to walk on the hill where the emperors lived and look down at the city that was the center of the world for half a millennium. And among the tourists and the archaeologists and the walkers is the possibility of stopping in one of the rooms, in the space where the floor was and the ceiling was impossibly high and the throne was at one end and the petitioners came across the marble, and trying to feel the scale of it, the physical fact of how large it was and how small it made. You feel, and what that feeling was supposed to mean and what it actually meant. That stopping, that attempt to feel something real in the ruins of something that was real, is the most direct form of historical engagement available, and also in some ways the most honest, more honest than the arguments about tyrant versus misunderstood administrator, more honest than the hostile tradition and the revisionist correction, more honest because it is just a person in a space trying to understand from the inside what it was like, rather than from the outside looking at. Interpretations of accounts of the thing itself. You can do this. You can go to the Palatine and stand in the ruins of the palace and try to feel the scale of it, and if you do, you will not understand Domitian. You will not understand the reign, or the terror, or the administrative competence, or the loneliness, or the fear. You will understand something about the scale of the ambition that built those rooms, and something about the passage of time that reduced them to what they are now. And that something is not everything, but it is real. And the real, however partial and however incomplete, is what we have. And what we have is enough to sit with in the quiet of a late night or an early morning, in whatever room you are in, and whatever moment of rest has come to you. The world outside is doing whatever it does. The stones on the Palatine are holding what they hold. The river is moving toward the sea. And the emperor who made Rome quiet has been quiet himself for 2,000 years. which is long enough for the fear to have faded, to have crumbled, and the name to have been restored to some inscriptions, and left off others, and for the whole complicated truth of the reign to have settled into the distance that makes historical understanding possible, if not complete. Rest now, let the distance do its work. Let the night hold what the night holds, and the morning will bring whatever the morning brings, and the stones will be there, and the stars will be turning above them, patient as stone, and the long, slow turning of the years will go on as it has always gone on, carrying everything forward into the next moment, and the next, and the next, until all of it and is permanent and is honest about what remains. Sleep well, the night is yours, and the quiet is deep. And somewhere in the deep quiet of this very late hour, the shape of a man who built the most magnificent palace in the ancient world and sat at its center alone, catching flies on a stylus, watching the mirrors in the corridors, is present in the way that the past is always present, not as memory, not as record, but as the shape of the world that was made because he was in it, still there, still visible, if you know how to look. And tonight we looked, and what we found was not simple, and what we found was not resolved, and what we found was true. Sleep well.